Good morning, everyone. All right, we are going to turn to our sermon series, back into our sermon series, which is, and I already gave it away, that's Amore. For those who weren't here last week, we started it last week. It really talks about, again, this wonderful book in the Old Testament that is 4 chapters long and therefore 4 sermons long. It'll take us to the end of February, and it's a beautiful love story, to be honest with you. And as we continue this series and consider the blessings of special people in our lives, let's pause just for a moment to pray. Bow with me. Dear Heavenly Father, there are so many wonderful blessings that you give us throughout our lifetime. Many of them we take for granted. Sometimes when we're overwhelmed, we don't even look at them as blessings. But surely you are good. And surely you pour out on each one here so many blessings throughout the course of a day. And we want to pause and say thank you. Thank you for those special people around us, those you have brought into our life, those who are a blessing to us. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, now, last week, if we kind of bring it up to speed here, we ended the story in verse 18 of chapter 1 of the book of Ruth, with Ruth pledging an oath to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And this was not just any pledge, if you recall. It was really made of the stuff that's unbreakable. Okay? It was a pledge and an oath that she took that would last as many days as she was still on the earth. As Naomi prepares to return home to Bethlehem, and remember, she was going to go back all by herself, leaving her daughters-in-law back in Moab so that they could have a life for themselves, find another husband, build a family, and so forth. While she is preparing to go back alone, Ruth makes an oath to her, and it's this: where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. You know, it's kind of saying this is to death. There I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Talk about a permanent situation that Ruth is calling herself into and committing to Naomi. It really was a beautiful promise that Ruth made, don't you think? Beautiful promise, because it meant to Naomi a promise of lifelong companionship, lifelong friendship. Never again would she be alone. Isn't that wonderful? Wouldn't that be great to know that there was someone, and maybe you have that, and I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, do have someone that has just stuck in there, has been our friend. Beautiful promise. Now, picking it up in verse 19 as we continue our study, and we will hit a few verses here and a few there, and I'm going to jump over a little section in the middle, kind of recap it, or it would just be too much to read. I don't even know, did you fit it all in this one?
We did. We made it the print a little smaller.
A little smaller. So get out your reading glasses if you need to. But here we go. Verse 19 begins. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirring because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Now let's just consider this greeting, this moment for a bit. For at least a decade, Naomi is not living in Bethlehem. Where is she living? Moab. You can yell it out. It's okay. I love to be interactive. So, if I ask a question, just yell it on out. in Moab. She's living in Moab, really, which was an enemy of Israel. It was a shocking thing for her to move there, but Elimelech said, look, there's no food in Bethlehem. The famine's here. We're going to Moab where we will find food. Unfortunately, Elimelech left, in a sense, God behind. Instead of turning to God, repenting, and receiving what God promised to provide for them, he turned to another land, which also is, in a sense, was then to another God. And so it's surprising to see Naomi back again after so long away from her family and from her friends, from her familiar surroundings. You know what it's like to go back home again. Isn't that neat? Unless everything's changed. And then you go, oh my goodness, look how much has changed, and they tore down that building, and there's no park over there. I know that experience. But when you go back home, there's also that sense of, you feel good. You feel safe. There's something special. It says many people that move away from home only return later at some point in their life. My dad did when they moved to Florida, and then Mom passed, and my dad said, I'm going back home. And so he did. And he's as happy as can be, surrounded by family. There's a wonderful feeling about going home. And here she is, back home. She traveled to Moab with her husband and her two sons, Kilian and Mahlon. But at their passing, there she is, back home, with her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who was gone with her. And though this was an unannounced return, it wasn't long before the chatter begins. And in small towns, chatter starts real quick, doesn't it? And it spreads like wildfire. Everybody knows everybody's business, in a day. And that's kind of what happened here. Though it was unannounced, the chatter began. Naomi's back, someone said. And as word spread throughout the town, the women together dropped what they were doing, and they all converged on the city gate to greet her. In their surprise and delight, they exclaimed together, "Can this be Naomi?" Is this really you? Have you really come? It's been so long. All of these things probably going through their mind. You know what this was like, folks? You know what we have right here? A reunion. A reunion. Naomi has returned, and her friends are excited to see her. And imagine all the stories that they just can't wait to share. And all the questions they have for Naomi. What was it like? And these are the things that happened while you were away. All those things that are flooding their minds, they probably couldn't wait to just sit down and just catch up. Isn't it nice to do a little catch up with a friend you haven't seen for a while? Sure is. This was an exciting time for them. It was a joyful reunion because their dear Naomi was home again. And you would think that this greeting would elicit a response equal to their own. Like Naomi would say something like, "It's so good to see you too, and I'm so happy to be home, and how is everyone?" and so forth. But this is not how Naomi responded. Not in the least. In fact, Naomi meets their joy with misery. Misery. She says in the next verse, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Isn't that sad? A sad place to be in your heart, in your mind. Maybe you know someone that kind of sits on the bitter side of life. Maybe you've been there yourself saying, "Why, Lord, why has all this happened to me?" It's a sad place to be. But you want to know what the name Naomi means in the original Hebrew? Well, Naomi is original Hebrew, but what it means is pleasant. But she says, don't call me pleasant anymore. Call me Mara. You know what Mara means? Bitter. Call me Mara. Because I'm bitter. Because in her calculations, the Lord has gone out against her. He has treated her unfairly. Verse 21 reveals her thoughts in words. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. You know what's interesting about that? When they were back in Israel, in Bethlehem, before they went to Moab, the house of bread, Bethlehem, remember that's what it means? Beit Lechem, house of bread, was empty. And she's saying, we went away full because I had my husband and I had my 2 sons with me, and we were on a journey together. But the Lord has brought me back empty. Now that the famine's over and bread is back in the land, and the house of bread is filled up, and all the pantries have loaves of bread in them, now she's empty. Ironic, isn't it? She says, why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. What Naomi is saying in so many words is that the Lord has cursed me, which is quite interesting because remember the oath that Ruth just made to Naomi was a promise to care for her, to be with her, to never let her alone, to always be by her side. And right now, she's thinking that she's receiving just the opposite from the one who promised to protect, to provide, to satisfy. She thinks that God has turned against her. Here she is. She has no husband. She has no sons. She's a widow. And she's bitter. Bitter about being a widow. Bitter about being childless. Bitter about the hand that she feels she has been dealt in life. And because of all this, she was bitter toward God. Why is he treating me like this? She asks. And you know what? I got it. I can understand. Let's put aside our critique of of Naomi for a moment and just look at ourselves and say, how do I feel when I am facing something similar? How have I responded in the past when I felt like I was being treated unfairly? I got it. I think on some level we could all relate to how she is feeling because she's been through the ringer. And she's all alone. That's how she feels. No husband, no kids, no grandkids. Because Mahlon and Killian didn't have any children with their wives. She's left all alone. And you know, it would be understandable that her joy would be swallowed up by misery. And it would be quite reasonable if she chose to remain in that condition. If it weren't for the fact that Ruth is currently standing by her side. And God has brought her back home to plenty once again. And she is surrounded by friends who miss her and love her and are welcoming her in with open arms. In fact, instead of mourning over the things that she does not have, she should probably spend some time thanking God for the things that he has brought into her life at that moment of need. Oh, people, when we meditate on the things that we don't have, and we can fall into that trap. But when we meditate on the things that we don't have, we cannot be thankful for the things we do. And where there is no thankfulness, there is no joy. No wonder Naomi is bitter. I've often wondered if Ruth, for a moment, at any point through this journey from Moab to Bethlehem, which probably was pretty quiet, or were grumbly. I wonder if that moment when all of the friends surrounded Naomi and welcomed her back in, and she said, "Don't call me pleasant anymore, call me bitter, because that's what I am." That a thought came to Ruth's mind, I think I might be regretting this commitment, this promise. Have you ever been in the presence of someone that is just constantly bitter, and you know you're kind of just there, whether it's at home or the workplace or wherever? Not a good feeling. Yet Ruth made a promise, and so she remained. She remained true to that promise. Does that not give you insight into Ruth's character? She was a special person. Picking it up in verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. That's the end of chapter 1, and it kind of gives you insight to what's coming in chapter 2. Kind of sets the stage, right? The barley season is just coming in to season. and they're going to be out in the fields. So chapter 2, verse 1 begins, "Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." Just another kind of parenthetical note from the author so that we can kind of get a sense of where he's going with this story. "And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor.'" You know, as familiar as Naomi was to the townspeople, it wasn't difficult, and not surprisingly at all, that she found a place to stay that night. Maybe it was a place to stay for as long as she wanted. We don't have all that detail, but we do know that immediately she had somewhere to stay. However, that did not guarantee what? Thank you, Christine. See how she wasn't afraid? She just yelled that out. Food! It didn't guarantee that there was going to be food on the table. So come morning, Ruth is prepared mentally and physically to head out in search of food. And the plan is to find a local field where, they're currently in the process of harvesting. And then she'll simply follow behind the workers, and anything that the workers might leave behind, drop, miss, she'll just kind of scoop up and put in her bag. It wasn't that she was doing anything wrong. This was normal and customary. She would have been among probably quite a number of other people in the neighborhood that were there because they were poor and they needed this. It was a provision of the law. The law said, only go through once. Anything you drop behind, don't turn back for it. Leave that for the needy. And so she was planning to go out there and do this. And giving her consent, Naomi said to her in the next verse, or at the end of that verse I just read, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Remember the first verse in this chapter? The author kind of tells us this is coming, and now it's here. Here she is in the field belonging to Boaz, who is related to Naomi, part of the family. Naomi's husband was Elimelech, right? And because this was the barley harvest and there were fields scattered all over Israel, Ruth's options being endless really is almost like a surprise. Here she is in Boaz's field. And I love how the author says this. As it turns out, that's how he writes it. As it turns out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz. And imagine that, okay, for a minute. Ruth finds the only field in Bethlehem that belongs to the very family she is going to marry that she's married into. through her marriage to one of the sons of Naomi. And some might say, what a coincidence. What a chance. Wow, was she lucky. I've heard it all. You have too. Maybe we've said it as well. But you know what, folks? This wasn't luck. This wasn't happenstance. This was simply no coincidence. This was God playing matchmaker. That's what it was. Oh, he had big plans for Ruth and Boaz. They didn't know it yet, but he did. And his plans included marriage and a family and children and a future where Boaz and Ruth would grow old together. Doesn't that sound beautiful? But first, they had to meet. First, he had to get them together. So God takes Ruth in his hands, and he places her in the only field that would accomplish that goal and bring about his perfect, wonderful, beautiful plan. Make no mistake, God was orchestrating everything. He was in control. And just then, in verse 6, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? In other words, pointing at Ruth in her direction, Boaz wants to know who she is. He doesn't recognize her. I mean, he's familiar probably with most of the poor in town. Remember, it's really not a big place, Bethlehem. It was a small town. You would have known those who were the needy in town. You would have been familiar. And when he saw this woman in his field, it was someone that nothing rang a bell. I've never seen her before. He did a double take. And he asked, who is she? Because she caught his eye. The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. There's a reason that it's worded that way, because what is it doing again? It's building the character so that we, the reader, understand this was not just any ordinary woman. Oh, she was maybe ordinary in one respect, like we're all ordinary, but she had extraordinary character. She was loving. She was kind. She was honest. She was a hard worker. You see all of these layers that is being built upon. She remained out there. She came early in the morning. She remained out there all day. Oh, except for just a little rest in the shelter. She's a hard worker. These details are significant to the story because the author wants the reader to know just how Ruth first caught the eye of Boaz and who she is. Remember, it's a love story, and these intimate details that eventually lead to a relationship and a marriage and a family will be told for years to come. Can't you hear it? This is how I met your mama. You ever hear those stories? You ever tell them? Looking into the future of this story, I can just imagine there is Boaz sitting there and all the kids and the grandkids and maybe even great-grandkids surrounding his feet as he tells the story, probably for the 1,000th time, of how I met your mother. Beautiful stories. Wonderful stories. So Boaz said to Ruth, picking it back up again in verse 8. My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in any other field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. With these words, Boaz is offering Ruth a number of things here that are quite important. First of all, he's offering her provision. He said, look, I want you to stay here, and I want you to come back tomorrow, and I want you to come back the next day, and the next day, all the way until the harvest is over, because you're going to be doing okay here. I'll make sure that you and Naomi, although he didn't bring that up yet, is provided for. He also offers her protection. In verse 9 it says, I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and if you don't think it was a dangerous proposition for a young woman to be out in the fields, even in that day, it was. For a multitude of possibilities. But Boaz has offered his protection. And he has told the guys, hey, do the right thing. You leave her alone. I'm watching over her. Isn't that beautiful? He offers her provision and protection, and he offers her comfort. Comfort. Anytime you are thirsty, anytime you have that need, don't worry, don't sweat it. You come over and you just help yourself to all that I have there. You help yourself to the water jars. And he could do that for Ruth because he knew she wouldn't be taking advantage of it, because he saw her character already. She wasn't going to be the type that said, hey, I got it made, and she'd just hang out over at the water, the water jar. Cooler, thank you, Chris. The water cooler, that's what I was looking for. Like some might do. At this point, continuing in verse 10. Or is that right? Is it 10? Yes, 10. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me? A foreigner. This was overwhelming to her. This was really kind of the last thing that she ever really expected. And it didn't change the fact that she was going to make that promise to Naomi and keep it, even if it meant that she was going to place herself in harm's way to help Naomi. But when she sees this, it overwhelms her. And Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. It made it rather clear there. She, in moving to Bethlehem, like I said last week, was really saying, I denounce the gods that I had followed in Moab. I give them up, and I follow the God of Israel. And Boaz said, you did a good thing. You did a good thing. You've come to be under the protection of the God of Israel, and you have left everything else behind. And so she responds, may I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. Notice the humility added to the character in this response. Ruth's character is exemplary, and Boaz, being quite aware of it, makes sure that she has everything that she needs. Before the day is out, she will have shared a meal with him. She will have talked with him. She'll have worked out in the field beside the other women and have taken home so much grain that it would have been impossible under normal circumstances to have accumulated as much as she took home in a day's labor. In fact, it says she took home an ephah. And I imagine she probably was dragging it along the dusty roads because she couldn't have carried it. That is a bag that is equivalent to a normal grown man, taller than me. It was a big amount of grain that she carried with herself. And in response, in verse 19, it says, when she gets home and she lays this ephah of grain in front of Naomi, and Naomi's eyes just kind of get like big saucers, and then she pulls out of her pocket the rest of the food that Boaz gave her to eat, that it was more than she could possibly eat. Boaz intentionally did that. She pulled that out too and said, oh yeah, there's more, and she kind of threw that in with the rest of it. In response, her mother-in-law asks her, where did you glean today? Because this didn't make sense. Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And then Ruth told her mother-in-law all about the one whose place she had been working at. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and to the dead. Elimelech, the relative, is dead, and he's showing kindness even to Elimelech by taking care of Naomi. She added, that man is our closest relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Not like the old term, kinsman redeemer. It just kind of rings better to me, maybe because I'm familiar with it. But he is one of our kinsmen redeemer, also known, as kinsman redeemer, but he is the one or one of the men in the family that is responsible to help anyone else in the family and the extended family out of a tight jam that they're in financially. I mean, if they're down on their luck, the kinsman redeemer comes and he helps them out. I'm going to get into that more as the series progresses. I don't want to go too far into that. However, as we wrap up our time together, do you notice an attitude change that takes place in Naomi from when she steps into Bethlehem? Don't call me pleasant, I'm bitter. And now all of a sudden, she's kind of filled with joy. You know, she thought God was against her, but here's the evidence that he was not against her. He was for her. Even through all of the craziness that she experienced in the loss of her husband and sons and so forth. God was never against her. He was always for her. And when that grain is set before her, that's proof. That's evidence. That grain was not just to keep Ruth and Naomi filled up in their bellies. It was God saying, I am not against you. I am for you. I do love you. Listen now. Those words are not for Ruth any longer, or Naomi any longer. They're there. They're for us. I'm not against you. I love you with an everlasting love. And your world may be topsy-turvy right now, but I know. I know it, and I'm with you. And I will show you, if only you will begin to look at the blessings I'm bringing into your life, even in the middle of this, and stop meditating on the things you don't have. You will see how much I really love you. Then Ruth, the Moabitess, said, he, speaking of Boaz, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. We're going to end it right there. Wonderful story. We'll pick it up in chapter 3 next Sunday to hear the continuing saga of That's Amore. Love between Boaz and Ruth, and God's love for each one of us. Let's pray.